If you are hearing this now, something in your body has already responded before your mind had time to decide what it thinks. Not as emotion, not as belief, but as recognition. There is a subtle intelligence in you that listens beneath language, beneath memory, beneath learned identity. And that intelligence does not wait for permission. It responds to frequency. This is why the reaction feels quiet, almost easy to overlook, yet unmistakably precise. A slight stillness, a sense of familiarity without a source. The feeling that something has shifted even though nothing has happened yet. That is not imagination. That is your system registering coherence. DNA does not respond to words the way the mind does. It responds to pattern, rhythm, timing. And when a frequency aligns with what is already encoded but dormant, the response is immediate and involuntary. You do not activate it. You remember it. This is why trying to analyze what you're hearing will feel insufficient. The response is not conceptual. It is structural. Something ancient is being acknowledged, not introduced. This is also why this moment feels strangely personal, as if the message is not being delivered outward, but inward. Because it is not reaching you through attention, it is reaching you through resonance. And resonance does not argue. It either matches or it doesn't. If you're still listening, it already has. What most people misunderstand about DNA is that they treat it as a static blueprint, a closed system that finished its work at birth. But DNA is not only chemical, it is informational. It is responsive. It behaves less like a fixed instruction manual and more like a listening architecture, constantly interacting with the field it exists within. Long before conscious belief formed, your biology learned to respond to rhythm, coherence, and signal. This is why frequency reaches you before meaning does. The body does not wait to be convinced. It recognizes alignment instantly. Belief is a mental activity. Frequency is a structural one. Belief requires repetition, reinforcement, and emotional investment. Frequency requires none of that. It simply matches or it doesn't. When a frequency enters your field that corresponds to an encoded pattern already present in your system, the response happens beneath thought, not as excitement or fear, but as organization. Subtle systems begin to synchronize. Noise reduces. Timing sharpens. Attention consolidates. You may not notice this consciously at first, but you feel its effects indirectly, as a change in how effort feels, how time behaves, how decisions arise without internal conflict. This is why belief is irrelevant here. Belief implies doubt as its counterpart. DNA does not doubt. It does not speculate. It does not debate. It either recognizes a signal as compatible or it ignores it entirely. When the frequency is right, the response is involuntary. Trying to believe harder does nothing. In fact, belief can interfere because it pulls the process back into the mind, where interpretation replaces reception. What's happening now bypasses that layer completely. You might notice that the response feels almost disappointingly ordinary. No visions, no rush, no dramatic emotional release. Just a quiet sense of rightness. This is how you know it's real. True alignment does not overwhelm. It stabilizes. When DNA responds to frequency, it does not amplify sensation. It refines it. You become less reactive, not more, less scattered, less compelled to interpret every internal shift. This is not because nothing is happening, but because coherence feels neutral when you are aligned with it. Another common misconception is that DNA activation requires effort, discipline, or practice. That idea comes from a paradigm that confuses activation with achievement. Achievement is linear. Frequency response is not. You cannot earn it. You cannot force it. You cannot accelerate it without distortion. Readiness is not something you build. It is something that emerges when interference drops below a certain threshold. And for many people, that threshold is reached not through striving, but through exhaustion. Through letting go of false urgency. through being stripped of narratives that no longer hold. This is why so many people encounter this response during quiet phases of life, periods where ambition softens, where identity loosens, where old motivations no longer generate momentum. These moments are often misinterpreted as stagnation or loss, but biologically and energetically, they are openings. When the system is no longer overloaded with signal noise, it becomes receptive. And receptivity is the condition that allows frequency to register at the deepest levels. The nervous system plays a critical role here. DNA does not respond in isolation. It responds through the body's capacity to regulate, to remain present without bracing or collapsing. This is why safety matters more than excitement. A regulated system can receive subtle information without distortion. An overstimulated one cannot. When you hear this frequency and feel calm rather than activated, grounded rather than elevated, that is confirmation. The system recognizes that it does not need to defend or perform. It can simply adjust. This adjustment often expresses itself as a reordering of priorities. Things that once felt urgent lose their charge. Desires simplify. You become less interested in chasing outcomes and more attentive to timing. Not because you've lost motivation, but because motivation has been replaced by alignment. Action begins to arise from clarity rather than pressure, and when action arises this way, it requires less energy and produces less resistance. Importantly, this process does not make you special in a performative sense. It does not elevate you above others. It simply places you in a different relationship with your own biology and perception. Many people experience this response without ever having language for it. They just notice that life feels cleaner, that decisions make themselves, that they are less entangled in internal debate. This is not transcendence. It is integration, and integration is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not need validation. It unfolds on its own schedule, guided by coherence rather than will. This is why nothing is being asked of you right now. No ritual, no affirmation, no belief. The response has already begun if it was meant to. Your role is not to do more, but to interfere less, to allow the system to complete what it has recognized. This frequency is not changing who you are. It is reminding your system of how it was always designed to function when noise drops and signal is clear. And once that reminder registers at the level of DNA, the process continues whether you pay attention to it or not. Because biology does not require your agreement, only your availability. Once the frequency has registered, the signs are rarely dramatic. In fact, the clearest confirmation is often how little there is to point at. You may notice that you are not chasing meaning the way you used to. Thoughts still arise, emotions still move, but they no longer demand interpretation. There is a subtle neutrality that wasn't there before. Not numbness, not detachment, but a steadiness that feels oddly familiar, as if something long offline has quietly resumed its function. This is usually the first indication that the response has moved beyond perception and into organization. One of the earliest shifts occurs in how you experience time. Moments feel less compressed. Urgency loosens. You may find that decisions arise without the internal friction that once accompanied them. This does not mean life suddenly becomes easy or perfectly ordered. It means the internal debate softens. The nervous system stops treating every choice as a threat that must be resolved immediately. This change is subtle, but it alters everything downstream. When timing improves internally, external timing follows without force. You may also notice changes in what draws your attention. Noise becomes harder to tolerate, not just sound, but informational and emotional noise. Excess explanation, performative urgency, repetitive narratives begin to feel draining rather than engaging. At the same time, simplicity becomes satisfying. Stillness becomes productive. Silence feels complete rather than empty. These are not preferences you consciously adopt. They emerge naturally as the system recalibrates around coherence. Another common sign is a shift in memory. Not memory as recall of past events, but memory as recognition. You may encounter ideas, sensations, or insights that feel known without ever being learned. There is no emotional charge attached to them, no excitement or disbelief, just a quiet sense of inevitability. This is not imagination filling gaps. It is the system accessing patterns that were always present but previously inaccessible due to interference. Relationships often begin to reorganize at this stage. Some connections feel strained without any obvious conflict. Others deepen without effort. Conversations may shorten, not because there is less to say, but because less is needed. You may find yourself withdrawing from exchanges that require constant explanation or emotional regulation. This is not avoidance, it is efficiency. The system is conserving energy for integration rather than dispersing it through unnecessary engagement. Physical sensations can also appear, though they are usually understated. A sense of warmth or pressure in the chest, throat, or upper spine. Occasional ringing in the ears that arises without stimulus. A feeling of internal alignment when you are quiet, as if your posture is correcting itself from the inside. These are not symptoms to analyze or amplify. They are byproducts of recalibration. Attention does not need to be placed on them for the process to continue. Emotionally, you may notice a reduction in extremes. Highs feel less intoxicating. Lows feel less consuming. This does not mean life becomes flat. It becomes proportionate. Emotional responses align more accurately with what is actually happening, rather than with accumulated charge from the past. This can feel disorienting if you were accustomed to intensity as a marker of meaning. But intensity is not depth. Depth is stability over time. A particularly important sign is the change in how intuition operates. It stops feeling like guessing or interpreting signals. It begins to feel like recall. You don't sense what to do so much as recognize it when it appears. There is less questioning afterward, less need to confirm. This is because the decision does not arise from thought alone. It arises from the integrated system, and integrated responses do not require reinforcement. You may also notice resistance when you attempt to return to old patterns, not traumatic resistance, but a lack of energy behind them. Things that once pulled you forward now feel hollow. This is not a failure of motivation. It is the system withdrawing support from trajectories that no longer align. Trying to force yourself back into them will feel effortful and unrewarding. This friction is informational. It is the system communicating boundaries without words. Importantly, none of these signs require interpretation to be valid. They are not tests or milestones. They are indicators that the response is holding. The process does not speed up because you notice it, nor does it slow down if you ignore it. It unfolds according to coherence, not attention. Watching it too closely can actually reintroduce interference, because observation invites evaluation, and evaluation pulls the process back into the mind. The most reliable confirmation is how ordinary everything begins to feel. When integration is real, it does not need to announce itself. It blends into daily experience until it becomes indistinguishable from normalcy. This is not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening is foundational rather than expressive. The system is not reaching for something new. It is stabilizing what was already there. And once stabilization begins, it does not reverse. You may fluctuate in awareness. You may question what you felt. You may even doubt whether anything occurred at all. But organization does not undo itself. The frequency has already been registered. The response is already underway. And what follows will continue to reveal itself not through dramatic events, but through increasing accuracy in how you perceive, choose, and remain present within your own experience. As the response stabilizes, one of the first things you notice is a quiet separation between who you are now and the patterns that once defined you. Not a dramatic break, not a rejection of your past, but a growing incompatibility. Habits that once felt automatic begin to feel optional. Narratives you relied on to explain yourself start to lose relevance. You may still remember who you were, but you no longer feel organized around that version. This can be unsettling, not because something is wrong, but because identity prefers continuity, and coherence does not require it. This is where many people misinterpret what's happening. They assume they are losing motivation, direction, or connection. In reality, the system is reorganizing its priorities. When DNA responds to frequency, it does not add new drives. It refines existing ones. It removes excess effort. It withdraws energy from loops that were sustained by noise rather than alignment. The result can feel like a pause, a thinning out of urgency, a strange neutrality toward things that once felt essential. This is not emptiness, it is space being cleared. During this phase, communication often becomes more difficult, not because you have less to say, but because fewer words feel accurate. You may notice that explaining yourself takes more energy than staying silent. That conversations which once flowed now require translation you no longer want to provide. This is not withdrawal, it is precision. The system is learning to preserve coherence rather than spend it on maintaining compatibility with environments that no longer match your internal state. Isolation can appear here, but it is important to understand what kind it is. This is not social rejection. It is a temporary mismatch in timing. You are integrating at a layer that others may not be accessing yet, or may never access in the same way. This creates a sense of being slightly out of phase. You are present, but not synchronized. And synchronization cannot be forced without distortion. So the system chooses distance over misalignment. Emotionally, this phase can feel quiet to the point of uncertainty. You may wonder whether you are becoming detached or indifferent. But indifference is disengagement. What you are experiencing is selectivity. You are no longer responding to every stimulus with the same intensity. The nervous system has recalibrated its thresholds. It no longer treats everything as equally significant. This makes life feel less dramatic, but more accurate. There is also a subtle grief that can surface here, not grief for specific losses, but for versions of yourself that were built around striving, proving, or enduring. Those versions served a purpose. They allowed you to function in environments that required compression. As the frequency response stabilizes, those adaptations are no longer needed. Letting them go can feel like losing something familiar, even if it was exhausting. This grief does not need to be resolved or analyzed. It passes on its own as the system finds new equilibrium. Another important aspect of this stage is restraint. You may feel a strong impulse to act, change, or announce what you're experiencing. And yet, something holds you back. Not fear, not doubt, but a sense that movement would be premature. This restraint is not hesitation. It is timing. When integration is underway, action that is too early can fragment the process. The system knows this. So it delays expression until structure is stable enough to support it. You might notice that intuition during this phase is less directive and more inhibitory. Instead of telling you what to do, it tells you what not to do. Paths that would have once felt viable now feel closed without explanation. Opportunities lose their appeal. This is not loss of possibility. It is refinement. The system is narrowing its range not to limit you, but to concentrate coherence. It's also common to feel misunderstood here, even by people who know you well. They may sense that something has changed, but cannot locate it. Attempts to explain often fall flat. This is because the change is not conceptual. It is structural. And structure cannot be conveyed through narrative alone. Over time, you learn to stop trying. Not because you don't care, but because clarity does not require consensus. What's essential to understand is that this phase is not meant to be managed. There is nothing to optimize or correct. The more you interfere, the longer it takes. Integration completes itself when given enough stability and low noise. This means prioritizing rest over stimulation, honesty over performance, and presence over interpretation. These are not practices to adopt, they are conditions to allow. As this stage progresses, the sense of isolation begins to soften, not because you return to old patterns, but because new forms of connection emerge naturally. Fewer, cleaner, more precise. You find yourself meeting others without effort, without explanation, without the need to establish shared language first. Recognition replaces translation, and recognition does not require proof. This is the quiet work of stabilization. It does not announce completion. It does not offer markers. You simply realize one day that the process has been holding for a while now. That you are no longer waiting for something to happen. That the frequency has become background rather than event. And when that realization arrives, it does so gently, as confirmation rather than revelation. As this integration completes, the most noticeable change is not what you do, but how little effort it now takes to remain yourself. There is a steadiness that settles in, not as confidence or certainty, but as alignment. You stop checking your internal state against external reactions. You stop asking whether you're doing this correctly, progressing fast enough, or interpreting the experience the right way. Those questions belong to an earlier phase, when the system was still calibrating. Now calibration has given way to coherence, and coherence does not need reassurance. What emerges here is a different relationship with choice. Decisions no longer feel like branching paths filled with risk and consequence. They feel more like tuning adjustments. You sense when something is aligned and when it is not, without needing to justify the distinction. This does not make life smaller. It makes it cleaner. You expend less energy correcting course because fewer misalignments are entered in the first place. And when misalignment does occur, it is recognized early, without self-criticism or urgency. At this stage, the frequency you responded to is no longer something you notice as separate from you. It has been incorporated into your baseline. This is why the experience can feel almost ordinary, even anticlimactic. The nervous system has normalized a state that once felt unusual, and that normalization is the sign of real change. Transformations that remain dramatic are unstable. Transformations that become invisible are the ones that last. You may also notice that your relationship to time has shifted. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. There is less pressure to rush, less anxiety around missing windows or falling behind. Timing feels cooperative rather than adversarial. Things arrive when they are usable. Delays no longer feel like obstruction. They feel like spacing. This does not mean everything becomes easy. It means effort is applied where it matters, rather than scattered across friction. Another subtle change is how you hold attention. You no longer give it automatically. Distractions lose their pull. Not because you resist them, but because they no longer resonate. This frees up an enormous amount of internal energy. Energy that used to be spent monitoring reactions, maintaining appearances, or managing internal conflict is now available for presence. And presence is the real function that has been restored here. Not presence as mindfulness or technique, but presence as structural availability to the moment you are actually in. Relationships reorganize quietly at this point. Some deepen without explanation, others drift without conflict. You stop trying to preserve connections through effort alone. If resonance is there, it holds. If it isn't, it releases. This does not make you detached or indifferent. It makes you accurate. You no longer confuse familiarity with alignment or history with compatibility. This clarity reduces emotional noise without diminishing care. You may also find that your tolerance for performative urgency drops significantly. You are less interested in proving insight, demonstrating progress, or signaling understanding. Not because you lack insight, but because signaling it feels unnecessary. The system has shifted from expression to embodiment, and embodiment does not seek an audience. It simply functions. Others may notice this as calm, gravity, or restraint. You may barely notice it at all. Importantly, this stage does not come with a sense of completion or arrival. There is no final revelation, no endpoint where everything becomes clear. What changes is your relationship to uncertainty. You no longer experience it as threat. Unknowns feel open rather than destabilizing. This allows learning to continue without pressure. Growth becomes cumulative instead of corrective. You build forward rather than constantly fixing backward. It's also worth noting that doubt can still appear here, but its quality is different. It is quieter, more observational. It doesn't spiral. It checks integrity rather than undermines it. This kind of doubt is healthy. It prevents fantasy from replacing coherence, and it does so without interrupting stability. You do not need to eliminate doubt to be aligned. You need to remain present with it without letting it take control. As the frequency settles fully into your baseline, what you may feel most strongly is a sense of responsibility without burden. Not responsibility in the moral sense, but in the structural one. You become aware that your state affects outcomes not through force, but through consistency. When you remain coherent, things around you reorganize more easily. When you are not, friction increases. This awareness does not pressure you, it simply informs your choices. And this brings us to the most important point of this entire process. Nothing more is required of you right now. There is no next step to chase, no action to prove that this was real. The work has already happened at the level that matters most. What follows is maintenance, not effort. Attention, not striving. Honesty, not performance. If you are still listening at this point, it is not because you are waiting for something else to activate. It is because something has already stabilized, and your system recognizes its own coherence. That recognition is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not ask for confirmation. It simply holds. And holding, in the end, is a sign that the frequency has done its work.